Hello and welcome to Battle Games Terrain Studio. In this video, I'm going to show you how I built this 6x4 foot Mars and Geonosis themed gaming board for Warhammer 40k and Star Wars Legion. This is my first ever video, so hit that subscribe button and stick around. Alrighty, so for the foundation of this board, I went down to my local hardware store and grabbed some 12mm MDF that's 2 foot by 4 foot. This is perfect as it's the same size as this XPS foam we're going to be using, meaning we won't need to cut anything. Now in preparation for this board, I knew that I would need a lot of rocks, so I started off by casting a whole bunch with these rubber rock molds from Woodland Scenics. I'm using 3 different molds so I can get a nice variety of rock shapes to work with. Mixing up small batches of plaster of Paris with a 2:1 ratio with water, stirring well and pouring into the molds. I then used a stick to push the plaster around the edges to help remove any bubbles that might be trapped. Making sure that the rock molds are propped up to avoid any spills. This plaster can take up to 30 minutes to fully set, so I'll keep my eye on it and make up some more soon. Now to build the foundation for this board, I put the MDF sheets on the floor of my garage as it needs to be a very flat and sturdy surface as we're going to be layering them up and adding some weight. I placed a sheet of XPS foam on top to make sure all the sides lined up and that no timber was sticking past the foam. Then I put down some liquid nails and placed the foam on top, putting all my weight on the board and making sure they lined up perfectly. A good tip when using liquid nails is to get a screw that you can thread into the nozzle when you're not using it to avoid making any excess mess, as it can be a real pain to clean up. I followed the same process with the next 2 boards, making sure to check that the foam lines up with the MDF before attaching them together with liquid nails. I had to be very careful not to disrupt the boards underneath and to only apply downwards pressure. I then added some heavy bottles to weigh it down as it dries. Now that my rocks have set, it's time to carefully remove them from the molds. These rubber molds can become delicate over time from bending out the deeper rocks and even start to tear in places, so treat them well, don't use too much force, and you'll get a long life out of them. Don't be too worried if some of the rocks break in this process, as you'll want as many unique rocks as possible, and it's better than breaking your rubber molds. Once you have removed them all, give the molds a good tap to remove any crumbs before repeating the process. After about 7 batches, I think I have enough for this project and I've sorted them into size tubs. Next I mixed up some PVA glue and acrylic matte varnish to seal in the board when I realized I had made a huge error. When mixing the two together, I noticed that it had started to congeal and became a thick, lumpy paste. This is super weird as I've done this before many times and I've never seen this happen. Perhaps my varnish had expired, but let me know in the comments if you've seen anything like this before. Trying to salvage it, I added some water and stirred like crazy to try to break up all the lumps. I didn't want to throw it away, so I added some black ink and then I painted it all over the board to start sealing it in. Once that was dry, I mixed up some black paint and PVA glue to go around all the board edges. This just helps strengthen those corners and makes the border blend into the background. It's also a good idea to seal in your boards because aerosols, epoxy resin, and some enamel paints will dissolve XPS foam, which can be pretty devastating, so make sure you do a test first. Next thing I did was draw up an outline based on a rough paper copy that I drew. I wanted to focus on modularity so that the board could be rearranged and played with multiple layouts. For that, I added a large hill that went over 2 boards so I could reposition them into smaller hills when rearranged. Then I did 2 large hills and 2 smaller hills, keeping in mind to leave enough space for scatter terrain as well. I grabbed out all my scrap pieces of XPS and started to mark out some hill shapes. Then, using my Proxxon hot wire cutter, I got to work cutting out all the foam. Now make sure to do this in a well-ventilated area and wear the correct protective masks, as these fumes can be toxic. With most of the landform starting to take shape, I used a sharp knife to cut away at some of the corners to create some sloped areas. And once I was happy with that, I used liquid nails to glue everything down. Now, as well as the fixed cliff sections, I also wanted to make a set of removable rocky spires to suit more of a Star Wars Geonosis style board. This will add dynamics to gameplay as removable terrain pieces, and also overall visual appearance for the board as they'll be made of foam and not plaster. For this process, I started cutting and stacking foam in all shapes and sizes, leaving some flat spots for models to take advantage from. Once I was happy with the cutouts I had made, I used a knife to cut some extra recesses and depressions to add some erosion to the rocks. I didn't get any footage of this, however, but you can see it in the final result at the end. Then I textured each individual piece with a ball of aluminium foil. This is a great and easy technique for texturing and weathering XPS foam. Once I had finished, I glued them all together with liquid nails and set them aside. These are starting to look so cool, and I can't wait to show you how they turned out. Now it's time to start adding some rocks to the foundations. To do that, I placed rocks all around where I thought they would look best, breaking the plaster if needed, and then attaching one at a time with liquid nails. And don't worry about the gaps in between the rocks, because I'll be filling that in with plaster later. With all the rocks in place, the board is really starting to take shape now. I just need to add a few more dynamic elements and then finish up these cliff sections. Inspired by a technique I saw in a Zorpazorp video, I decided to cut some chunks out of the board to create depth but not interfere with scatter terrain. This is a great idea, and if you haven't heard of Zorpazorp, you must be living under a terrain rock or something, but go check him out because he is the king of terrain tutorials and a huge inspiration of mine. After that, I used my heat gun to create some shallow low spots that just makes things feel a bit more natural and less like a flat board. I also decided to 3D print off some awesome pipelines as scatter terrain to help add that industrial Mars sort of vibe I'm going for. Now I'm going to be making up some modeling compound using plaster of Paris, this hand shredded tissue paper, and water. Mixing up small batches at a time, starting with the plaster, and slowly mixing in the water until it's all smooth. And then I slowly add the tissue paper in until it's like a cottage cheese type consistency. I use my left hand to apply it to the area, keeping a jug of water handy so I can keep wetting my fingers, because when the compound touches the rocks that are set in place, the plaster will suck a lot of the water out of your modeling compound, and I needed to keep it moist so it's workable and to stop it from setting. This also only has about 15 to 30 minutes of working time here in Australia, which is why I'm working in such small batches. I'm using this dental tool called a flat plastic to help shape the compound into rocks and blend it all together. For this, I'm simply using the shapes of the existing rocks and continuing them on by following the cracks and the rock lines. When my compound had started to set and was no longer workable with my hand tools, I dumped it on top of the hills to use as a ground cover, working it in like clay with wet hands and smoothing it down until it had a nice natural shape. For the smaller hills, I mixed up a much runnier consistency, and this way I can just pour it straight over and it will find a natural shape. Then when it's half set, I'll go over again with a wet hand and smooth it all out like clay. With the rocks all dry and looking awesome, I grabbed some sandpaper with a pretty rough grit and went over all the hill shapes to catch any high spots and to smooth out any lumps. Now that I have a nice smooth land surface, I'm going to be adding some ground texture. For that, I'm using a multi-purpose filler mixed with water till it's a smooth paint-like consistency. Then I added some very fine aquarium sand, a little bit of leftover grey, and a heap of chocolate brown paint. Using my largest brush, I stippled the texture paint all over the board as well as the tops of all my scatter terrain pieces. Trying to avoid getting any paint on the cliffs because we're going to be doing something a little different with those soon. With the texture paint down, it's really starting to look great, giving the board an awesome earthy undertone. Next, I added some small and large rocks and some sand. I applied PVA glue around the base of all the cliffs and on the top in a few spots. Then I added the large rocks first, then sprinkled in the small rocks, and then the sand. I also did this to all the scatter terrain. Once the glue had dried, I went over the entire board with a watered down PVA to about a 50-50 ratio. I did this process twice over an entire day just to make sure all the rocks were locked down, and then the board was ready for some painting. I went over all the board edges again with a matte black spray paint just to tidy them up because it's easier to do it now than at the very end. Then once that had dried, I covered all the board edges with some blue painter's tape to keep it safe from what happens next. I used this Loop brand chocolate brown spray paint I got from Crush City here in Brisbane, and I primed the whole board using a small piece of cardboard to help protect the cliffs as best as possible. I also used some black spray paint and undercoated the scatter terrain at the same time. Now it's time to paint the cliffs with a method called leopard spotting. Using cheap acrylic paints, I've mixed up 4 washes just using paint and water: yellow, orange, red, and a darker red oxide. We want to make sure it's nice and thin, but still carrying enough pigment to color the rocks. Starting with the yellow, I brushed it onto the cliffs in random patches and let it all wash down the cracks. While it's still wet, I then added the orange and the red as well, letting the colors all blend together. Essentially what we're doing here is creating some nice natural undertones so that the rocks don't all look identical. Once that was fully dry, I then did another coat on all the cliffs with the red wash, and this should help deepen that color and bring them all together, but still showing those awesome undertones. This process has also colored the rocks we added earlier, making them now all match in with the cliffs. With that looking amazing, it's time to add some red to our ground texture. I found this red iron oxide powder and thought I'd try it out by mixing it with some red paint and some burnt sienna. It could also be used to mix in with some sand or grout to help add some red in another way. Once I had a nice dark earthy red, I did a dry brush over all the dirt to help match it in with the cliffs. I also dry brushed the same colors over my scatter terrain pieces so they all match at the end. For my second color, I wanted a light sandy brown to start highlighting the raised areas of the ground. I mixed up some burnt sienna, warm yellow, and antique white. For this dry brush, I'm removing most of the paint from the brush and pressing nice and lightly to avoid any streaks. I also gently went over all the cliffs to help highlight some of the high spots and the rocks. For my last highlight, I'm using antique white, using my largest brush and removing about 98% of the paint, then using a downwards brush stroke, I gently went over all the cliffs and the dirt again. This helps give off that realistic effect that the sun is hitting all the high spots. For one of the last steps that will take this board to the next level, I'm going to be adding 2 bags of Mars Earth Base Ready mix all over the board. I mixed up a 50-50 of acrylic matte varnish and water. Mixing well to make sure it's nice and smooth, and spray over the entire board. Using this little flour sifter, I dusted the whole board with Mars Ready base mix, holding it up nice and high so there is an even coverage. The reason I'm sifting it on is so I can keep all the rocks aside so they don't interfere with placing scatter terrain, and also so I can place them around the top and bottom of the cliffs afterwards. Once that was done, I sprayed another 2 coats over the entire board to lock it all down, and then it's ready for some dice. There we have it. This 6x4 foot Mars themed board looks absolutely awesome, and I'm really proud of how it turned out. All the different tones from the dirt to the cliffs are something that I'd never tackled before, but really enjoyed it, and I hope my client does too. The modularity of this board is something that I really like, giving so much freedom to new setups and different layouts. As well as the scatter terrain, it really brings so many different elements to the tabletop, making for some awesome games. Thank you to everyone who's watched my first ever video. Please let me know what you think in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe because I'll be doing heaps more videos in the future. Also, go check out my Facebook and Instagram page where I post my latest projects and have loads of content of other boards that you might like to see. That's all for this one, guys. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next one.